Can a team with as much history and resources like Ferrari fall victim of your own technical perfectionism? Today we are going to crumble how Ferrari really arrives at the Grand Prix of Britain 2025 and why his struggle is no longer for glory, but for pride. The epic narrative that Ferrari had wanted to build the return of the champion, the perfect alliance between young talent and winning experience began to crumble under the weight of an indomitable car. The pressure in Maranello was felt. The engineers worked counter-relish to solve the suspension problems, the technicians incessantly adjusted the heights of the car, and the direction of the team no longer talked about titles, but of recovery. At this point, it's not about winning, it's about not losing more ground. And so, with open wounds but still with some hope, Ferrari arrives at the Grand Prix of Great Britain. Not as a contender to the title, but as a team that seeks to reunite, meet its identity and prevent a season that began with fireworks ending in silence and resignation. The question that everyone is asked is whether that latent potential that Ferrari showed in his best days will finally materialize, or if the myth of the rampant Cavallino will be buried again for his own technical decisions. The key to the conflict that Ferrari lives in this 2025 season is not in the pilots, even in the team's direction. The heart of the problem beats in the SF25, a car conceived to mark the beginning of a new era, but that in practice has been an inexhaustible source of problems. The idea behind this car was clear: break with all of the above. Under the technical direction of Loic Serra, the design team decided to bet on a completely different philosophy. They redesigned the chassis from scratch, modified the geometry of the front suspension by changing the pushrod system for a more aggressive pull rod, and developed a new flat background aimed at optimizing the channeling of the airflow to the rear of the car. It was a risky but necessary commitment to the impossibility of continuing to develop the concept of SF24. However, this technical revolution brought with it a series of non-anticipated consequences that have compromised the global car's performance from the first moment. One of the biggest weak points has been the rear suspension. Designed to adapt to the new aerodynamic demands, it turned out to be too soft to support the loads generated by the car in rapid curve. This has forced the equipment to raise the height of the car to avoid the extreme wear of the flat bottom, thus compromising aerodynamic efficiency in line and high-speed curves. The SF25 has ended up being an extremely sensitive car, with an operational window so reduced that finding the ideal setup becomes a titanic task, even for experienced pilots such as Leclerc and Hamilton. This technical problem has had a direct impact on the strategic decisions of the team. Under normal conditions, Ferrari can no longer take risks with the car adjustment. You cannot afford to experience too much with the configurations because the margin of error is minimal. That has considerably reduced the equipment adaptation against sudden changes in the weather, asphalt temperatures, or the evolution of the track. In Australia, for example, when weather conditions went from dry to wet, Ferrari was trapped in a technical limbo. The car had no rhythm either in one condition or in the other. The response of the engineers was conservative, prioritizing the reliability of the performance. But in Formula One, the lack of audacity costs points. Despite all these stumbling blocks, Ferrari has not yet thrown the towel. In Austria, the team took a step in the right direction. A key update was introduced, a new flat background that increased aerodynamic load and improved car stability. The result was immediate. Ferrari was consolidated as the second force of the weekend, showing more consistent performance and a better career reading. But it was not enough to sing victory. It was only the first phase of an improvement program divided into two parts. The second phase is planned to be implemented in Silverstone, a circuit where the average speed is high and the stability in long curves is essential. This is where Ferrari expects his new aerodynamic package to shine. New body elements, possible rear suspension adjustments, and an improvement in the cooling system are part of the plan. The bet is ambitious. Turn SF25 into a car that is not only fast in ideal conditions, but also versatile and easier to configure in wider ranges. If this update fails, the risk is not only to lose points, but to yield the second place of the Mercedes Construction Championship, which would mean a direct blow to the project that Vasseur has tried to consolidate since its arrival. At this point of the season, Ferrari no longer has margin for errors. Each session counts. Each data collected in free practices is valuable. Each conversation between pilot and engineer can make a difference between a weekend of redemption or one of frustration. Great Britain's Grand Prix will be, in that sense, more than a simple career. It will be a fire test for the SF25 and, above all, for the spirit of a team that still wants to demonstrate that it can live up to the legacy it represents. Ferrari appears to the Great Britain Grand Prix with 210 points in the Construction Championship, just 1 point above Mercedes, which converts Silverstone's career into a scenario of maximum competitive tension. There is no longer talk of reaching McLaren, whose domain is almost absolute, with more than 400 accumulated points. The focus has been completely moved towards a struggle for runner-up, a fight that, although it does not imply the glory of the world title, has enormous weight in terms of morality, institutional credibility and projection towards the future. Silverstone, with its mixture of fast curves such as Copse, Maggots and Beckett's and demanding traction zones, is a clue that has historically been cruel to poorly balanced cars and extremely sensitive to any weakness in the chassis or in aerodynamics. For Ferrari, this circuit will not simply be a place to try updates. It is an open-sky laboratory where the complete SF25 package will be examined under pressure. The second phase of technical updates arrives just in time, but with an added pressure. Not only should they work, they must do it from the first moment of Friday. There is no room for mistakes in tuning. There is no space for hesitation in strategic decisions. The configuration must be accurate, and the pilots must have full confidence from the first round. The figure of Lewis Hamilton becomes especially relevant here. Not only because he runs at home in front of his audience, but because he is the pilot with more experience in this layout, with multiple victories and poles in his history. Its ability to find rhythm in difficult conditions, added to its emotional connection with Silverstone, can offer Ferrari an invaluable psychological advantage. In addition, after his promising performance in China, where he managed to place himself in the first rows in sprint classification and felt one with the car, his adaptation curve to the SF25 seems to have stabilized. His presence is no longer just symbolic. It is strategic. Charles Leclerc, on the other hand, arrives in Silverstone with an imperative need for claim. Despite being the longest pilot within Ferrari's current project, his season has been marked by avoidable incidents, strategic errors, and a constant struggle to feel comfortable inside a car that punishes any deviation from his operational window. In the team's environment, it is perceived that Leclerc needs a clean weekend, without incident, without errors, to recover the internal leadership that begins to share with Hamilton. Silverstone is also a character test for him. But beyond the pilots, there is the team. Fred Vasseur and his coaching staff face a silent but definitive evaluation. The 2025 season was raised as the first year of consolidation after a 2024 where Ferrari finished runner-up. Everything pointed out that this year would be that of the final assault on the championship. But the erratic performance of the SF25 has questioned that narrative. If in Silverstone the updates do not work as expected, if the car remains equally inconsistent, if they fail to minimize operational errors, the project could enter an internal trusted crisis. And in Formula One, when that happens, the recoil is not linear, it is abrupt. In addition, the external context adds pressure. Mercedes comes with an ascending dynamic. Kimi Antonelli is adding points regularly. George Russell has been one of the most consistent pilots of the season. If they manage to overcome them in Silverstone, they will not only take the second place of the championship, but they will send a direct message to Ferrari. Their window of opportunity is closing. And the paddock observes. What is at stake in Silverstone is not just a classification in the table. It is the course of the project. Ferrari needs to demonstrate that, despite errors, the technical vision he proposed by 2025 has a future. That the engineers did not err in their diagnosis, that the pilots can execute with confidence, and that the team management has control of the narrative. A bad result in this scenario would mean giving the initiative, not only in sports terms, but also in the general story of the season. The look to the future begins here. Silverstone can mark the beginning of a sustained recovery or seal the failure of a project that, in theory, should take Ferrari back to the top. The difference will be in the details, in the correct reading of data, in the surgical execution of the strategies, in fluid communication between the wall and the pilots. Ferrari has the pressure of its history, but also the possibility of rewriting its present. Everything will depend on what happens in each curve of the legendary British layout. And what do you really think about Ferrari's present? Do you think this team, with all its inheritance, its resources and the talent of its pilots, can redirect a season that began with so much enthusiasm and has ended in frustration? The history of Formula One is full of unexpected returns, of teams that knew how to transform the adversity into a technical evolution, of pilots who found it their time under the inspiration to resurface. But it is also full of projects that were lost in their own complexity, which bet on wrong technical paths and moved away from the podium not due to lack of talent, but for lack of clarity in their purpose. Ferrari is at a turning point. If the SF25 does not respond in Silverstone, if the strategy is not perfect, if the pilots do not execute surgical precision, the consequences will not only be sports. The impact can reach the foundations of the project, from the continuity of certain engineers to the way in which the 2026 car is defined. Each decision they make this weekend will have long-term repercussions. Each free session will be a test field. Each race, a declaration of intent. Therefore, your opinion is more important than ever. Do you think Hamilton will be the catalyst that Ferrari needs to win again? Tell me in the comments. I want to know if you also see in Silverstone an opportunity for redemption, or simply another chapter in the long list of recent Ferrari frustrations.